Yeah. Hello, everybody. Took some time to set everything up, but I think we finally made it. Welcome to the live chat with the one and only Barry Mazor from Nashville, Tennessee, who's live with us for the next hour, something like that. And we're going to talk, of course, at length about that wonderful book you wrote, Barry, that most of the people here probably will have read already, I think, but some maybe not. And first of all, my name is Bas Sewardson. I'm the moderator, and I think a lot of people know that as well by now for the Facebook page, our EBI YouTube channel, and the website as well.
They should.
And and of course, Barry Mazur is a legendary writer that has so many things already on his curriculum, and he has had it just recently, of course, that wonderful book, Blood Harmony. Maybe Barry, we acquired quite a lot of questions the past few weeks. We asked our members to send in things they wanted to know from you during the chat. And so I collected them and we get to it a little bit later. But maybe it's nice to take people a little bit on a trip, on a journey to how you came to write this book and how that process went. Because I remember we've been in touch since 2022. And that's already 3 years ago. That's how long that process took. And we were happy to contribute, of course, with a lot of our material to help you on your journey to write a book. But well, take us. You've done it before, about 20 times, you said, a few months. So you got some
Goes
experience.
with the job. Yeah. Yeah. Well, the amount of time that you're talking about, boss, is I signed on to this group as soon as I realized this was going to be my next book project. And before I say anything else, I want to thank you and Marshall and so many of the members of the group, a number of whom are acknowledged in the book itself, in the back, who were especially helpful for all the conversation about this and the input and the stories. It couldn't be the book it is without what the fan club group that evolved to this did over the years, that so many of those records have been kept and preserved, from the smallest local newspapers to reports of Manila and Honolulu that made a great difference to what I could do. How did I get into this? Well, I have to tell you that, sure, I've been a fan since I was a kid, but that wasn't the issue. I would have written it earlier, right? So the issue was that m- writers about popular music, about
Mhm.
American music history, about country music, rock music, have been asking for a long time what, in our kind of eyes, is that there hasn't been a book on the Everly Brothers that you could confidently quote and turn to for the best possible information of the story. This is not to make light of the fan written books that have existed over the years, most of which are many decades old now at this point and don't do
That's
their
true.
whole lives, but or had other handicaps, like trying to do it from England without ever getting a hold of people in America. There were Ike's Boys and Walk Right Back. These were substantial efforts. But
Mhm.
there wasn't something that a reporter, a writer, a historian would turn to with the sources listed, a deep dive into what was going on, and to get it out there. Plus, fan books may turn to deal with the individuals on a certain kind of level of, yeah, they're beautiful, they're handsome, they could do no wrong, and they sang perfectly. But that's not doing justice to the human beings who were live, who they actually were. What
Mhm.
did they think they were doing in the room? What were they trying to do? How did they react to the things that took place? And that's what a historian and a biographer does. It's different from a memoir written by
Mhm.
family and friends or themselves. It is a biography. And what came to be the centerpiece of what have tried to do, and I think done to some extent, people seem to agree, is
Mhm.
bring together the story of who these two brothers were and what that had to do with the music that came from them. Those things are closely linked. As much as anybody I've ever written about, and I've written about, interviewed hundreds of people and written for 50 years about this music. So that's one answer. The other thing is I wanted to do it.
Well, that's important, of course.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it becomes a chore. And well, I always said we've been talking in the past, of course, a couple of times, and we're always full of anticipation. When will the book arrive? When will the book arrive? Because it got some delays, as some other projects have as well, and it's not a bad thing necessarily, of course, because you can tweak it and include everything that you want to include. But it's also very, like I said before, it's not easy task to, and I've read a lot of biographies that you have to combine and balance the serious. It's a serious subject. You want to treat it seriously, but
Yeah.
still make it an entertaining read. And I thought you
That too.
succeeded pretty
Yes.
well in that. So that worked out pretty well. Okay, well, of course we're very happy to accommodate you with a lot of material, and of course you did a lot of research yourself. Maybe you can tell a little bit about that to us.
Yes. Yeah.
Go
Yeah.
with the
There
story.
are resources. There are resources available. First of all, to everybody now that hadn't been. I mean, where the internet has gone, there are for all the work that the fan club did with all those clippings and things. There are newspaper resources from the different times and places, much more than was the case, right down to pictures of the Everleys in high school from the local paper there, which nobody was paying attention to because nobody knew who they were yet. So and there are oral histories that have been
Mhm.
collected in different archives in music in the country hall in UCLA. I know people are very curious about, I got to see the TV shows. Well, forms of those have been in archives also. So you do all of that. You hit every single book that's ever mentioned them. It doesn't mean just Everly Brothers biographies. It means biographies of all the people they ran into and dealt with. There's another element here which I want to get to early because it answers some people's questions about, who did I talk to and who did I not talk to, which they always
Mhm.
want to know. It's that this is now history. I know it still shocks people, but a couple of weeks from now in November marks 70 years since the first time the Everleys walked into a recording studio. This is history. Not a single person is now alive who had anything to do with the hit Cadence recordings at the time. The last one was guitarist Ray Edenton, who died at 96 just as I started to do this project. So it wasn't a question necessarily of who you talk to. Also, some of the people who are around, uh, immediate family and their kids. Well, they weren't around when those early things were happening. And so what you're talking about is a different level of secondhand stories. What did your dad tell you as you remember it? And there's no way to check that. So as much as you can, you go back to the original sources. Of the
Yeah,
people who
sure.
still are alive, many of them are 83, have been dining out on their stories of what I did with the Everly Brothers for 50 years. And
Mhm.
their memory of those now is not necessarily better than what they told people 50 years ago.
I understand what
So,
you. Well,
so my preference is often to go back to what they said then, not the way they've had time to filigree it, play with it, forget some of it. So these are just the way a professional writer goes about things.
Yes, and of course you got a cross reference. Stories are told again. They're told by various people, and they contain the same information. You can say, well, that's something that you can rely upon.
Yeah, you
So
look for what buttresses that story. Is there other evidence that does it? Is what was the circumstance? What was the timeline? Uh, what did they say that other time? Believe me, the Everly Brothers did, as you know, plenty of interviews in plenty of places over many, many years, and they didn't
I
always
know,
give the same answer to the same question themselves. And
and
watching that evolve is part of the story.
they're not even consistent themselves. Because I
Why would
followed
they
them
be?
also.
Yeah.
They don't. Sometimes they remember it differently, and you see that in television. What you should know that, but they saw so many things. They were touring and sitting in hotel rooms, playing concerts, recording. Eventually, you don't know what you did at any time anymore.
And professional performers of all sorts know who's asking the questions, and they know what one interviews after as opposed to another, and it doesn't make them dishonest that they want to tell the person to a degree, spin it so they tell them what they want to hear. and
I
you
feel
have to
that's
sort
also
those things out. Yeah,
and
you just have
what
to.
kind of state of emotion they are. You know, that's I noticed that. Yeah, if they're
Absolutely.
talkative
Definitely
or they
with
don't
these
want to
guys,
talk,
yeah.
or,
Yeah.
and that happens. But of course, you could fall back on a lot of resources. So, and I know a lot about the athletes, just like other people here. You know, they've seen quite a few things, of course, and I have to say, well, I could follow everything in the book, and there were hardly any things that I said, well, I don't know about that or something, you know. So, and some surprises as well that I say, oh, I didn't know about that. But you talk with
Yeah,
all
yeah,
kinds of people that you never.
I have no doubt about one thing. This group knows more about this subject than any other group that I've spoken to about this. There are people who think they know things, and I know there are people here who really do. So um, I'm interested in what they have to ask and what they have to say. But I've been all along, as you said, I've been in conversation with this group for like almost 4 years now. So
You get to know the people a
I
bit.
haven't hung around just for my health. It's good to be here.
Yeah. Well, you're welcome, of course. Well, talking about questions, there were quite a few people who asked
Yes,
very different kind of questions. Some are more direct, others more philosophical, I would say.
sure,
Maybe
sure.
we take some time to get at the questions, and later on, maybe people. I want people ask over here, can they hear us? Okay, are we communicative, understandable? Maybe people can do something in the comments if they're okay with it. Not too loud, not too soft. Or from
Yep,
my end, everything looks well. I think very it's good quality. I think of audio and video. So, and then we go to the questions. I collected a few here on one page. I have to
sure.
check with another system here on my desktop. I got there's some reaction coming in, so that's a good news, I think. From Preston Beale, well, you know about him. He's been around on the
Yes,
page
sure.
a
I know
long
Preston.
time. From Connecticut, USA. He's got quite a long sentence. He really thought about it, I think. He asked, when you were fully immersed in research, what percentage do you feel of admiration, awe, surprise, or sadness over the elements of bad decisions and bad fortune? And that's a long sentence, but after that he says, did you ever feel you wish you were them or glad that you weren't? In other way, in other words, do you want to take places with them, so change places with them,
Yeah. Well,
if you
first
could?
of all, I don't tend to want to change places with performers anyway, because I'm not one. I don't think the people here would necessarily know, but I grew up among them. The reason I'm comfortable talking with and about performers, I do grow up in a family that had some of that as part of the story. I've always known professional performers, and I get and I do believe that I have some sense of how they feel in situations and what they want. Um, Certainly, I'm not looking for the kind of adoration the Everly Brothers achieved, and
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't want to have their worst days either, Preston. That's what there were some pretty rough times and certainly emotions. Um, I get along with my sister better than that, but there's a lot of siblings who have a lot of issues.
You don't have to be on the road all the time with your sister. I think
No, no, no,
that's
not.
one
I have
thing
not
that
been.
happens
I
with
as
everyone.
I say to people who ask about that, it's like that. Did they hate each other? Question, which I don't think they did. But if I was stapled to my brother or sister at a microphone, we're practically breathing on each other for 60 years, and away from my immediate family for hundreds of days a year, and
Mhm.
people want to see us mostly in exactly that situation, and they call us each half of the Everly Brothers. I could get tired of it too. Um,
That's true. It's a blessing and a curse, of course, what they had. And
Don Wayne, the road manager, people will know here from 1963 to 73. We did talk about this, and he said if it was my brother, I just would have killed him. So,
I think that's a real
yeah,
thing, I think. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Now we got a question from the UK and also one from the USA. There were two people with the same question. Actually, it was on my mind as well a bit.
Okay.
When you were doing your research, were you running into any kind of surprises that you say, "Oh, I never expected that," or um, maybe something that you
Oh,
were reluctant
oh.
to include in the book, or did you say, "Oh, something that"?
The only thing I'd be reluctant to put in the book was stuff that wasn't nailed down and buttressed enough to say I can go with this. This is the job of professionalism of a major publisher, not a fan book publisher. You don't mess up. I think this might be true.
Mhm.
And when there's even any question in the book, you'll find I say so or give different interpretations of what was going on. Surprises, boy, certainly. As a writer, that's what makes it worth doing. If there's not a sense of
Mhm.
discovery over years of writing, it's pretty discouraging. I've had a couple of books I just stopped because there wasn't that sense of discovery. There certainly was in these guys. That very
Mhm.
idea that well, the book's Blood Harmony. If somebody's asking that, yeah, that's yeah.
I just saw it
But
on my
around here,
screen as well.
everybody know that by now. It's plastered all over everything. Yeah, the Blood Harmony, the Everly Brothers story, and I'm Barry Mazur. Okay, uh, there was a regular sense. There was a regular sense of discovery of that. The core thing I said about how much their individual personalities and how they related
Mhm.
to each other over time was involved with the music that they would make and the decisions that would be made about that music is as close as I've ever seen among any. I I I, I didn't know that going in necessarily. I knew
Mhm.
just so much about their lives. I knew a considerable about their music, and I'd read the previous books. I was interested in. Yeah, I bought and read Walk Right Back years ago myself. Sure, because I'm interested, but that took me just so far into who were these individuals. So the relations with the parents, the relations with each other, the relations of hell, I didn't know that to say in the studio they could be so experimental as they were before their time. I I didn't know how their views evolved over what this music was they were doing, even what to
Mhm.
call it. So the short answer is certainly there were surprises and there still will be. It doesn't even stop. At some point, this is now the publisher's book. At some point, you get off the pot and you say, that's it, that's the book. And,
Mhm.
there's still more to learn later. Nobody has
Mhm.
the last word on this, including me.
But there wasn't anything that you say, well, I'm reluctant to put it into the book, or
They are, and
it's okay.
if there are, I'm reluctant to talk about it now, too.
That's what a good journalist has to do. You
Yeah,
have to
yeah,
be
that's
prepared so that
right.
you don't get some
Yeah,
information on that. Now I
yeah.
understand that, Barry. Of course, that's logical. These questions, by the way, were from Christine Warren and Cindy Farlin. And Cindy Farlin actually had another question. She asked, maybe you know about it. I've heard something about it, I think. But on their own time, what music were they into, Don and Phil?
Oh, well,
Do you have some?
I go into that in considerable detail in the book. There was the music they were raised on, which was much wider than people understand. If people loved songs our daddy taught us, and why wouldn't they? They could think
Mhm.
that that was the picture. But the fact is, they were exposed to a very broad variety of music. And, if you listen to that record, you wouldn't know that they loved black vocal groups of the 40s like the Ink Spots and the Mills Brothers. You that the country music that they were particularly exposed
Mhm.
to when they were kids was already the country boogie of people like the Delmore Brothers or the Milo Twins. um, they loved, so given the age they were, I say first they were in the country music, which became
Mhm.
their first thing, and there's reasons for that were practical because they knew all this music and loved very wide variety of music. But called the age of Hank. So yeah, they loved Hank Williams and Lefty Frizzell as the kind of songs
Mhm.
they did. But they were, that's 1950. By 1953, they're getting to be teenagers, if young ones, and
Mhm.
and they were aware of all the doo wop bands that came along, the Clovers, and then Bo Diddley, who was a special influence. They heard all of that. They always had big ears, as we say. And as far as
Mhm.
you can tell from listening to what they had to say, who they performed with, and who they commented on the over the years, they never stopped listening to what that was. I mean, if you
Mhm.
saw them on stage with Simon and Garfunkel, they did not know this in 1952. It's like the taste never stopped, and it came right to the
Mhm.
end, right near the end of his life. Phil was still complimenting some of the young current artists who were covering their songs and things. So, yeah,
Mhm. And I
one of the
think that
things that
Don,
they loved a lot of music and they understood a lot of music.
I think Don, because he lived in Nashville, of course, a long time, he was also listening to the country scene, whatever was happening later
Sure.
on, when he lived there for a long time. So, okay, I think that answers the questions pretty well. We got a question here from Mike Wilson from Ottawa, Canada.
Sure.
And it's a long sentence again, so bear with
All
me.
right. I'll listen.
There seems to be a consensus that because of song selection, the early Everly albums on Warner Brothers were not successful. Do you think the masterful nature of all those early Warner albums will eventually be universally acknowledged? And will we ever finally learn which musicians played on which songs?
Well, yeah, that's a long sentence. That's about four different points. All right. Let me get at you know, what does accepted and do well and successful mean? If your only measure is did you have how many uh pop singles did you sell? It's not the only way
Mhm.
to measure it.
Of course,
And
I
I
think.
think anybody who's interested in the music of those later years of the 60s time with the Warner's albums are going to say album after album, especially, you know, they weren't all perfect gems, but if you look to the rock album, the R&B album, the first country album, which was years ahead of its time in what that
Mhm.
sounded like, you know, neither country radio nor rock radio understood it at the time. But if you listen to it now, it's a beaut. Now, by the time they got around to Roots, they were getting, you know, more often widely spread critical recognition. It doesn't necessarily sell that great either. We all recognize
Mhm.
it now. So I don't judge, and I don't think music criticism or history judges by what was instantly a success. Also, where were you? If you were living in England, like some people listening right now were, then Gone, Gone, Gone and Love Is Strange were still big hits, right? They didn't score that well in America. So where you sat might depend on how you thought about that. But I salute them for the resilience through that time. They kept trying new things, and it revealed the album with the Kinks too. You know, Two Yanks in England. You know, all of those very varying projects was just a reminder of how wide their musical interests and abilities have been in the first place. In a way, when you know, it's a little hard when you're 40, 50, 60 years old still be expected to sing songs with a straight face about falling asleep in a drive-in movie with your girlfriend and getting in trouble. You know, they can only do it with a certain irony. They were adults, you know, and they came to do adult music. And I'm glad they did personally. Now there are some parts of the fan base that just wanted to hear those hit singles over and over, and it's always that way for people lucky enough to have any.
Mhm.
But I think history has already started to show, and if this book contributes in any way to people having a broader understanding of how important their contribution to music was, then I will have succeeded in what I mean to do.
Okay. Well, I think he also means that in what way will the songs really recognized as artistic highlights, um, that they will be
That's what I'm
appreciated.
after.
Yeah.
I think there are people who, when they heard I've written this book, they say something like, "I really love that era," and by that era they mean 1957 to 63. By
Mhm.
that era, I mean 1945 to 2005. You know,
Yeah.
this is the era of their lives and their careers, not the era of what you might have known before you read this. So there will
Mhm.
be revealing things to people who only think of them that way.
That's
And I
true.
hope it
Yeah.
expands the picture.
And I don't know about the musicians played on the songs. Isn't it not in the Bear Family box set? I
Oh,
think you're right about it.
there are some that are missing. I mean, there are records of this. I I I think there's a misunderstanding of musicians' situation. You know, I know some of those people that played the sessions in Nashville or the Wrecking Crew in California. You're talking about people. I know some who played on 14,000 records. And and a fan or a reporter comes in and said, "What did you do on that one on a Tuesday in
Yes,
1974?"
that's
They're supposed to. This is not an understanding of the way musicians work for a living. They may, you know, truthfully, if something goes really wrong or goes spectacularly right, and you know, they may remember that, but work a day. So, you know, Bear family and Andrew Sandoval in particular are pretty meticulous. If there's things missing there, it's because there was no record. They
Mhm.
often have union records of who was in the studio that day, or or records from the record company of that day. But if those aren't there or were lost, then you're asking for things that are unlikely to ever be uncovered at this point. There's been decades to find them.
No, that's
So,
of course.
and I think, I mean, truthfully, you can reach a point where it's just pedantry. Why do you care who that was that day? How about listen to the record, take it in, and enjoy what's going on? Honor the achievement, not the effluvia.
And people have different taste and
They
interest, of
sure
course.
do.
That's always the case. I'm a big
That
fan
would
of
be
all the
my
things that
answer. That would be my answer to that. Yes.
Andrew Sandoval does with other
Yeah.
acts as well. And sometimes, and that's the thing with the book, if you do it very meticulous, it can become a boring read. Of course, that's the disadvantage that you have. You're very complete then, but
Plus, I
and
know
that's
people who only want to have the Everly's record with the blue label and not the orange one. And that's, not my cup of tea.
that's perfect. Um, there's also another question from Mike Wilson. He says, I wonder how early in the writing process you decided you would not address the afterlife of the Everly's legacy. And in this case, he means disputes amongst their heirs and spouses over the estate up to the present.
Oh,
And things come to mind
okay.
like Cathy's Clown, of course, that was in the debate. There was some stuff about that, of course. You talk about it in your book, I think.
I
But
talk
perhaps,
about it to the degree that it was possible, and I mean that in two ways. I think this group has had the advantage of hearing what Venetia Ember had to tell afterwards. The family
Mhm,
was involved in a lot of legal issues at the very time I was writing the book, and there were simply things they didn't want to talk about. Those who wonder why I didn't talk to them more, it was because they had legal advice not to talk about some of these things those things got settled. You notice that Venetia Ember and Jason and others in the family have stepped forward to point out that they approve of the work that I had done since.
mhm,
So some of the questions you're asking were not settled or public. I can tell you that I knew about many of them. There were a lot of
mhm,
stories about those last years with Don and et cetera that were I was aware of. But again, I wasn't in a position to buttress them or nail them down. The ones that appear in the book, which give some indication of the directions things had gone,
mhm.
were legally clear, and they were on the record other places where I could say with assurance this was
Okay.
true. And I might say that if you when you work with a major worldwide publisher like I do, lawyers went through every word of what I had to say to
They
see
had
that
to.
I wasn't shooting my mouth off and getting into trouble. So let's
Mm,
say I said what I could, both in the sense that it was possible to do, and then I had the information nailed down. And
okay.
if they weren't that, it's not in the book.
Well, personally, I think it's interesting to know about it, but nothing more than that. It's not part of their legacy, real legacy, of course. It's just what's going on, and I think in a lot of families is going on, especially if there's money involved.
There,
That's
there,
how it
there are
works.
people who thank me. I've had a lot of chance to hear how people are reacting to this thing by now. It's months, and there are people who are thankful, and some of the reviewers that I didn't go into a lot of gossip, as they call it. What included with that, between gossip and history, it's a matter of opinion and taste. But there are people who thank me for not doing a gossip book. There are other people who say, it's kind of impersonal in third person. It's not like if you know a memoir by their wife or kid. Well, no, it's not. A memoir is a very different thing. I almost wish there was one of those out at the same time. It would have brought more interest to both of us. But that's not what I do for a living. I don't have personal memories, and the people who do, you want just so much of that in this kind of thing. There will be other books. Perhaps the family will do some kind of thing, but I think I struck a balance that's good for most people.
Okay. Yeah, I think so too. So that's. We got a question here from Helen Gross from Little Haywood, Staffordshire, England,
Hmm.
with a kind of philosophical question, I think, here. Do you think the lack of real friendship, in fact, added to the beautiful harmonies? And I think you can look at that from different angles, but maybe we can have your take on that.
They're meaning real friendship between the brothers themselves. That's the
The,
way I
the, the
just
lack
heard
of
that.
real friendship, in fact, added to the beautiful harmonies.
No, it didn't subtract from them either. Well, eventually it made trouble. Look, I'm gonna reiterate something I've been telling people, which only became clear to me late in the process. Here's why I'll
Mhm,
answer that. Um, all of the real altercations you hear about between Don and Phil, where there's like a fist fight in the studio, or somebody's thrown off the bus, or any of those sorts of stories, they always happen over one thing. Don reached a point where he was really feeling hampered by having to do those locked in harmonies all the time. And we've all heard what he sounded like from the in the 70s and later when he felt like it, when he started to sort of improvise and scat and do the well, yeah, yeah,
mhm,
that stuff. Um, th- those fights almost always happened when the harmony was broken, when it became impossible to keep that tight harmony, which is what we think of as the Everly Brothers sound. Phil told people late in life, one interview, and also directly to
mhm,
a shared friend, a friend of mine and of his, songwriter, singer Sean Camp, who were talking about it. He told him, as well as several interviews, that that very touching line that close harmony is a great expression of love. Well, now,
mhm.
if you were Phil and you felt like that harmony was the expression of love, how would you feel when it was broken? So you see, yes, the harmony and the relation were connected. Most of the time, it worked just fine. Most of the time, actors go on stage when they're not feeling well and their wife just left, and there's still the part to do that day. Same with
Mhm.
singers. If you don't know, all kinds of things happen, and people want the same show. By the way, they didn't ask them, "Were you off today because you're miserable or you're really happy today?"
No,
No,
you gotta come
they're
back to that.
actual people, which I need to get at.
Mm,
And, not just pretty boys with ducktails, they're actual people. And, well, that could change things from time to time. Of course it did.
There's a question here from Gene Crosby from your town, Nashville, Tennessee.
Okay.
Does the author know the Everly family or one of both brothers before they passed away? And I think in the past you met some people of them, someone like Margaret, for example, you did,
No,
or
I did not meet Margaret. I did not
I
meet
did
Margaret.
not
No,
meet.
look, I
Okay.
didn't know I was going to do this thing. I had interviewed Phil. I had spent some time with Phil because he was much more around and available than the others. I feel very bad that I never interviewed Don, especially at the end. But you have to realize how a journalist works. Um, I moved to Nashville in 2003, so they were very last years of performing together. I was here.
Mhm,
Don was here that whole time till he died, but he wasn't. He wasn't doing public performances or discussions. He wasn't putting out some new record or book. There wasn't an impetus from a
mhm,
news standpoint to talk to him just then. And I really regret it. The thing I missed is when he appeared at the Musicians Hall of Fame to get the award for his famous Wake Up Little Susie guitar riff. I should have been there. I don't remember what else was going on that day wasn't. I regret it. And I think
mhm,
we would have gotten along well, frankly. But from what I've seen of friends of mine who did spend time with him, like the reporter Bob Orman, the good news was people
mhm,
like Bob had done hundreds, so many hours of interviews with Don over time. But if you're in a newspaper, you interview a guy for 3 hours and they print two sentences. It's not a book. And he made
mhm,
available to me all those other hours of unpublished conversation with Don, for instance. So, yeah. And Phil, I interviewed first for my Jimmy Rogers book. I wanted to talk to him about the way they did Tea for Texas and Roots, which was to totally deconstruct it, pull it apart,
mhm,
and turn it into two other things. So this is the kind of thing I was after in that book. And Phil was around. So I mean that's the answer. And I go back to this. Did you spend time with the family thing? I think I've expressed my feelings about the ways that can and aren't necessarily valuable for this kind of project. I'm glad to know them, and they've told me that they're glad to know me at this point. But I think people make more of that than is actually matters for getting it down. Margaret
mhm.
did 9 hours of interviews with the Country Hall of Fame unpublished. They were doing an inventory of all the stuff she kept of the memorabilia, and
Mhm.
they were going to do an exhibit in 1990s, and they went and talked to her and walked through all of her memorabilia, some of those books that she wrote. But she talked for 9 hours, and I had transcript of the entire 9 hours of Margaret talking, which no one's ever heard before. And that Margaret is in my book. Some of the people who did it's you have to look at the way a writer works. And it isn't just did you have lunch with their daughter? Did you get
Mhm.
your picture taken with their wife? That doesn't get you anywhere in
No,
terms of really telling the
yeah.
story. So, in
Mhm.
some of the places, I wish I'd known more. But as I also said, the people who were still around were not necessarily there in an intimate way to have inside information from the time.
Mhm.
They may have stories. I've had this done, I mean, in my Ralph Peer book, I interviewed Bix Beiderbecke's son, who was around in the 20s, because at this point it was all you could do. But with the Everleys, that was not all you could do.
Mm.
So I did the things that could be done.
Correct. Um, I skip ahead a little bit because there's Kenneth Foss from Madison, Wisconsin. Has a question about the rift with their mother. Uh, he's very curious because he wasn't invited to the reunion concert. Can you tell us some more about the relationship without resorting to gossip?
Oh
Is
no,
there
no,
anything on
no!
your?
That relationship is clear, and it isn't gossip. And I had close friends of hers talk to me that were in that neighborhood where that house was, who knew her for years. Um, Again, that was the kind of buttressing because the stories gel. Let me say, people who didn't like Margaret much and people who loved Margaret to death told me more or less the same stories about her. So I'm pretty sure we were getting clear stories. She wasn't a simple person. I think she was a pretty brilliant person, and in some ways a lot like Don, which may have caused tensions between them. But she'd like to have her story become the dominant one. And I think I go into this in the book where, she was trying to write books. And listen, Don and Phil didn't write books because they felt like, and they told multiple people this, his version of the story of mine would be so different that I don't think either one of we would be doing anything useful for either one of us to do it. And they felt that way about their mother's accounts also. Too many fish to fry. And in her case, the fish was usually I was responsible for their success. I was responsible for, how they were. And she was to some real degree. She really was an impetus when they were young to keep them going, which was a big thing. But she wasn't, there was a limit to her musical understanding and her vocal capabilities. And I think sometimes she was right to feel overlooked. Reporters would talk to Phil, talk to Don, talk to Father, and not talk to her at all. There were times where she really was made less of than she was. I came to the conclusion, she was a very good talker and she was good on the radio as that host and doing the
Yes,
commercials. And I think
if
it's
we
a
need,
dang shame that she didn't pursue that. We had she could have been a down home radio host for I think for decades. If it had ever occurred to her, it wasn't a punishment to do that. It was
yeah.
where her talent lied.
And of course, you moved the act forward as well. I think without her, they may have quit earlier on and not pursue
Yeah,
any
I
musical
agree
success.
with that. I
Was
agree
that
with that. I do. Yes.
okay? Let's go to another subject. There are quite a few subjects here, and it makes it interesting, of course, to talk about. It's not all the same. About the cover picture, well, there's been talks about it ever since even before the book was published, I think. Why did you choose that photo? It's also a matter of choice. Some people love it, others say you could have chosen another one, but maybe we'd like to hear your thoughts about it. That.
Let's talk. First of all, this was something worked out with the publisher. If you look on the back of the book, I don't know how many
Mhm.
have. There's a picture of them head to head, haircut to haircut at Newport, and that was my
Mhm.
original proposition, and it is the back cover. The publisher came up with this, and at first I thought about it a lot, and I came to love it because this is what the book shows. What's going on? It's not. This is not another pinup book. Every single book has had the beautiful everybody smiling and on stage. Well, this is not their life on stage. This is their life. And that's them. The people who know the best said, boy, does that shot capture them. Look at what it has. They're in the same room. Don, more of an introvert, is brooding on his own. He was known to do that quite a bit alone in a room. And
Mhm.
Phil is the extrovert is looking out into the room for more information or
Yeah.
affirmation. These are, I think, who these guys were. It's certainly the people that I show in the book, and it also says to people that this is not another fan book.
No.
This is not about lovely boys with lovely hair. This is about two people, and it says this is going to be a serious dive into who they were. And I want
Mm.
people to, the publisher wants people to understand that from the beginning. So this was
No,
the
I
right
think
place to go,
it's,
and I'm very happy with it.
okay. I can understand your point of view. It really says what's going on in their lives, not only smiles and superficial things, but more in depth reviews
I
of their
think it's a
lives.
very revealing photograph. Yeah.
Let's keep it at that. Okay. um, there's a question from Ian Anderson from London. In order to meet a publisher specification on what amount of text do you have to leave out, or make efforts to increase it? Or in other words, why is the book the length it has? Or,
Ah, okay. Well, I dealt with that. There was once a version of this book. You were talking about how I had talked to you and probably even mentioned in the group, but I certainly talked to you guys about it. You and Marshall. That there was a point where I thought I was about done. Well, that version was 150,000 words, which is 30,000 words more even than this. And that couldn't work for the publisher because they have practical realities to deal with. It would have reached a size where the price of the book would have had to go up substantially, and
okay.
it wasn't by their estimate a price that they wanted to live with. They could have talked about making the typeface so small that people went blind trying to read it, and we didn't do that either. Well, you know what? They
Mm,
left it up to me to do that. I didn't have editors put an axe to this book. Don't and no one should think that. They said, "Look, it's got to be less." And I
okay.
trimmed it. Mostly it was tightening. There were things that
Mm,
I gave broad space to that I was able to tighten down. There were words that I
mm,
was able to tighten. There were sentences I was able to tighten. It was not a difficult job to turn it into the 120,000 word book that it is. And I think it's better for it. I can tell people if you're wondering what that would have been, I think you're better off with this one.
mm. Well, you could, of course, have extended the digital version.
No,
There's no
yeah.
problem.
The digital version is the same as the book. The audio book,
Uh,
God God bless Webb Wilder. He read all 120,000 words of it out loud, which is more than I'm ever going to do. So they're
okay.
all the same, and they're meant to be the same. And I'm saying I made those cuts. I don't think the book would have been better if it had those words. It's better the way it is.
Okay. Well, I think it's exactly the right length, so I don't have any trouble with that. So,
Yeah.
um, there's a question from Carol Land from Chatham, New York. She always thinking about a sequel, like a scrapbook of photos or family memories
No,
or whatever.
that will be somebody else's job. I'm not a scrapbook maker. I'm an author and I and reporter, and that could be up to someone else. There happen things like that. Maybe heck, this group could practically do that. But no, that's not my job.
Well, we talked about it earlier, of course, here before the chat, and we said, well, there'll be a second edition maybe to your book.
Well, second edition in the sense that after a certain amount of, at the publisher's discretion, this is their book now, at
Mhm,
their discretion, and it's a part of what we intend to do.
mhm,
There will come a point where there'll be a paperback, which and the paperback it depends on if the hardback sales are still going well, and they are going well, folks. At
mhm,
a point when they start slack off enough to say it's time for that, the paperback is an opportunity to not major changes but minor ones, and I want the people to know who have offered me uh, dispute some of the things online. I'm not going to say correction because as I said, some are corrections. There are mistakes in there like
Mhm.
The director Stevenson, Venetia Stevenson's father's name, that I have no idea how that changed from Robert to Richard. Of
Robert
course, I
Richards.
know who he was. I describe his career in there, and I don't know. That'll be fixed. That is a mistake. Some of the things
Mhm.
people have called me out on are matters of interpretation. They're
Mhm.
disputing what I said. They're not correcting me. But I have written down, I have made note of every one of those. And when the
Mhm.
time comes, there's that business about the age of his kids versus Don's wife at the end. That's just an error. I believe that was an editing error. You know, things happen when you're going over and over and over. And the book was heavily fact checked by professionals, you should know. But
Mhm.
there seem to be about a half dozen places where we could do a fix. And probably will be fixed. In fact,
Mhm.
by my
So
option
there-
in the paperback edition.
so
That's as
there's
much as you can do. Did that with the previous books too.
Mhm. So there's still hope for the purists.
There's no hope for purists. You can never be right. There'll be something
So
else. Yeah.
a little
I
hope then.
typed it with the wrong fingers, you know?
Yeah, that's understood. That can happen. It doesn't detract to me. It doesn't detract from the whole story.
And as my own
And I know,
editor
and there's
said,
no, yeah.
my editor does 2 dozen major books a year and has done it for a long time for very major writers. And he
Mhm.
said, you know what? There is no book that comes out that doesn't have a few of those ever. Bad news, folks. We are actually human beings out here doing this work. Also,
Sometimes I see some questions popping up. We read them, of course. On the question, we can do one in between. Did Phil like England? I think he loved England actually. So, and the weather
yeah,
was, of
yeah. I
course,
mean,
was always good.
that's in the
I
book. I
remember
mean,
we saw them many times in the UK, and he had
he
always a
considered
cold.
moving there for a while, and then decided he missed. Oh no, he loved the place.
But he always had a cold. I remember that.
Yeah.
Wearing scarves and that kind of stuff. So, but he loved England. That's for sure. I think, and still the Everleys were very popular in the UK, in the Netherlands. That's
Yeah.
really a home base for them. So, let's see what I can find. Somebody, Kenneth Voss is here, also about a riff with their mother. It was a question of his, but he's talking about the Everly sabotaged their career by breaking up with Wesley Rose. But of course, I really don't call it like that. It just happened because of temptation. Of course, there was a recording and Wesley Rose didn't like it. The question
Yeah, it
after
would be
that is,
more like Wesley Rose tried to sabotage his career because they left him, and they had good reasons to. It got
but
settled
he
over
was
time.
asking what kind of thoughts do you have about that trajectory? You know, what happened with them, and did it really influence their career? Could it have been different?
You know, there's a part in the book where Phil talks about that. You know, I think
Mhm.
very articulate about it, which is that if you think about anybody you ever known in pop music, yeah, 5 6 years is the most almost anybody gets. Yeah, take the Beatles. What is it? It's 1963 to 1970, and then things move on. So they got 7 instead. the people who the people who last, as far as I'm concerned, the Everleys lasted a lot longer than that. They had a second comeback around 1970, a first around 1970. They had a second comeback in the mid 80s. This is remarkable when somebody can do that. So if you look
Mhm.
at people that are around 30, 40, 50 years, whether it's Frank Sinatra or, or Bob Dylan or, name it, Dolly Parton, um, that's very special and extremely unusual. Most people get 5 years and out. I think the Everleys did a terrific job of persevering and being around because, they really wanted to do that stuff. And they kept doing it and they kept finding audiences who wanted to hear it. So I think the trajectory is what any talented person who knows who they are would do.
Mhm.
On one hand, they keep at what they know. On the other hand, they're open to change with times. They, if you're in the music business for 60 years, you're going to be in some very different music businesses with some very different audiences. At one point, Don made the crack. The people out here today may have been born while they were playing "Bye Bye Love" in the car your parents were in.
That's true. That's true. Um, let's see. I think personally, I think it definitely damaged their career. We could have so many other great albums like "It's Everly Time" or "A Date with the Everlys" instead
Yeah,
of "Instant Party" or "Both Sides of an Evening." And We love every song they do, of course, but I think yeah, that's still a missed opportunity. I think
You
that
just
they
hit you just Baz, you just hit on another thing, which is that they reached a time where the album was more the thing that it had been. When they came along, it was an age of absolutely age of singles, and it did
Mhm,
quite well with it. And when by the point, in a way, it was lucky that when they turned to albums as their main expression. It was the age of albums. Sure, there were
mhm,
still singles, and people were wondering why they didn't have hot singles. The kind of
mhm,
music they were making, it turned to free form FM radio, not to top 40 AM, either country or pop. So in many ways, those albums fit in with those time with that time. It was one of the ways that they were not throwbacks.
mhm. Well, that's true. That's true. Um, I got a question from one Marshall F. Beckers. You may have heard of
Heard of
him.
him, yeah.
Yeah,
Hi,
don't know
Marshall.
what's going on with him nowadays, but he's got a question. Actually, I talked about with you, and you also already mentioned something about that. The success of the book. Is there any numbers are known or?
Oh, it's too early for. I haven't asked yet. It's in the life of a book. It's still too early. I know it's doing well. They told me so. It reached a national bestseller list in America a few weeks ago. At one point, it was brief, but it was peaking. I mean, they get to call it a national bestseller. And by the way, if you look at places like Amazon, it immediately became possible to discount it because of how well it's doing. So
No.
you might check that out if you haven't bought it yet, or you're looking to give a gift for Christmas. It's cheaper right now because it's been a bestseller. It's doing
Okay.
quite well for this kind of book, and I will not even ask about the numbers till maybe it's 6 months out towards the first of the year because that eventually affects me too. There's a
Mhm.
there's an element of royalties and what you wind up getting paid for it, but it's doing very nicely. I know that much, and I would hear about it if it wasn't.
Now we got a feeling of the positive reviews and the amount of reviews you have.
I'm
That's
still out here.
it
I'm
all.
still out here promoting it now and in the
Mm,
weeks ahead at book festivals in Nashville and in Kentucky at the end of this month. People are asking, "I'm going to do the Kentucky State Book Fair." I'm going to be featured in, which will be interesting given how Kentucky plays in the book. But yeah, no, I'll keep at it, and it's doing well. I can tell you that much.
okay, that's always. We already knew about it a little bit. I think we saw it in Amazon, of course, very high placed. So that's already a good sign, of course. Do you have next to your events lined up in the States also something going on outside of the United States, whether it be
Well,
digitally or personally?
yes. Yes, actually, there's one thing already done. Some of these interviews are recorded and they want to clean them up, edit them, make sure they sound right, and they don't appear for months. They also have their own schedules. There's a very, there's a pretty cool group in London they started out doing just really regions of England kind of writing coverage, but they have a thing. It's entirely about authors' books on music. They did a thing with me about this book, uh, lengthy, over an hour, and it'll be on sometime in the weeks ahead. They
Okay.
haven't told me the exact date yet. You'll know when I know. You'll
Okay.
be alerted. I think it was a pretty good talk. They
Okay.
vary. There are 5-minute talks and there are 2-hour talks, and I have alerted you folks of all of them. And
Mm.
they vary in quality, they vary in intensity, but so do the interviewers. You're not supposed to say that, right? But
You're
but
glad they're
I've been
interested, of
pretty
course.
happy about
The
them so
main
far.
thing.
I've
Yeah.
been happy about them so far, and I'm particularly happy when they go a little more in depth and ask about the process, and if they were surprised by things about the Everleys, they show a certain amount of knowledge or new knowledge about it, and
Mhm.
hit the
Yeah.
right spots to ask questions about. Often the same ones I asked about.
Well, let us know if you find if there's something else going on. Just post it on our Facebook page, and people can enjoy your travels around the
Yeah,
globe, or
and
at
you've
least around
linked
the
them. I
table.
mean, they're out there. They're not going away, at least for now.
That's true. That's true. I see we got a question. I think you can read it as well from Candace.
Did I have
Um,
trouble getting people to talk with me? Well, generally not. I already explained about some members of the family during the very time I happened to be doing the work. They weren't talking to anybody. Um, that might have, it would have been nice if they had, but as I've explained, it was it didn't damage the book. And they were
Mhm.
close friends of hers of theirs who were aware of that and didn't want to talk either. I'm not going to go into names on that, but let me say this: as I said, most anybody around that I could have talked to there were that would be useful. There are long records of what they had to say by now, and in some cases, it would be better. It was better to go back to earlier versions anyhow. I There were people that I regret not talking to. One of the reasons that I value the older books, like Phyllis Karp's Ike's Boys, is she interviewed a whole bunch of people who have long since died.
Mhm.
And they may not have asked the exact questions that I would have, but at least she asked them some questions. So we
That's
have
the
their
advantage if
testimony. I
you
mean,
do that
this is
early
this is
on,
the
of
way
course.
history works. I always say, people say, did you talk to the family? Did you talk to this musician? I mean, they've asked me about every single side musician who ever played with the Everleys. Let me tell you, it wouldn't necessarily be all that revealing, except for the moment they were in.
Mhm.
Some are more articulate about these things than others, but I mean, if they said to me, I said, if I was writing a book about Abraham Lincoln, they said, "Oh, did you interview him?" There
Most
comes
likely,
a
yeah,
time. It comes a time when it's just history, folks.
yeah, that's true. And that by now, I think the time is has arrived. I think.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. I've got actually a question of my own that I didn't see appear anywhere
Oh,
else.
sure.
What are your own favorite songs or albums?
Ooh.
Yeah, I know you listened
Well,
to Bird Dog when you were 8 years old, but
I hate to, yeah, yeah. I hate to do that. Let me put it this way. I had talked about it one time. I put together a little list, and I'm not going to remember all of them now because I'm 75 and I'm getting dense. But but I tell you this: one of the surprises was the sheer amount of songs over the years that they did that were on the dark side. I wasn't expecting it, and I had at least one of the Everly Brothers Bear Family boxes before I got into all this. I mean, I had a pretty wide recognition of what they'd done in the Warner Brothers years, but I didn't know the things like the one that ends with a gun in the hand and suicide. I didn't know. I didn't know the Collector. I didn't know some of those songs like that,
Mhm.
which were among the surprises to me. And they really did branch out and do interesting things. I can talk about favorite albums when people ask me, well, if you never heard any of them, go ahead and get the hits. Get the original ones. You can get the cadence hits now as they
Mhm.
first appeared. I'm of
Mhm.
exactly the age where I heard the Warner Brothers versions first because that's what was out there. When I was in college radio in 1969, 70, that's when the original recordings started to come out again. I was very excited about them because they were,
Mhm.
I mean, I think they were on the whole better versions of those songs.
Mhm.
But I
Mhm.
love what they did in the Warner Brothers years. I tell people, look, start there and then surprise yourself with things like the sing country hits from the Warner's years and uh
Absolute favorite of
beat the
mine too. Yeah.
beat album. I said,
Mhm.
check those out. They're wonderful. Check
Mhm.
out what they did with Dancing in the Streets.
Mhm.
Don't forget the Music City, right?
Yeah, that's right. Mm. But
The
what was your favorite song before you got into those box sets? I mean, you must have a couple of
oh
favorites. Is there any
Oh,
particular song stand out?
probably the same ones as everybody else. I'm not. I mean, I love Bye Bye Love and Kathy's Clown and those things too, and the beautiful harmony ones, Devoted to You, those things. But
Mhm.
but I'd already like things like Gone, Gone, Gone as a rock song. And I like too many to pick. I don't know if it's interesting what I do pick. Is that I listen to them wide. I
Mhm.
also tell people to get Roots as the next one. I tell them to get I like the Born Yesterday album from the 80s. I
Mhm.
said, you're not gonna get a picture of them without jumping around like that son. A lot of good music. I think
That's
we all
right.
agree on that here.
Yeah, there's no problem there, I think. I was just curious, maybe you have a
Yeah,
special
yeah.
favorite or an album that stands out or and
Well, the ones I just named are to me ones that stand out and people should definitely hear. Yeah.
that is true. Maybe we're already talking about an hour. Well, you mostly did the talking, but um, What I like to ask the people who are now currently logged in, maybe they have some questions they want to ask
I'm
Barry.
willing to go on. If it ends, it won't be because I ended it. All right.
I believe we have a little bit of a delay between the people that we're talking and what they get. It's about 10 seconds or so. So we'll
Sure.
wait a little bit. In the meantime, I think we can reveal, we'll be talking about it. Um, we always have our yearly Christmas quiz, and we'd love to give away a couple of Blood Harmony books. And
Well, you know, it's going to be possible to do that. I've arranged it with the publishers. The publishers appreciate what this group has done for interest in the Everly Brothers, and I made that clear. And there will be a couple of books for that kind of thing.
okay, well, that's something we'll be talking about later, and we'll let people know, of course. And that's going to happen in December, of course. So maybe even signed by the author. I don't know if that's possible,
Well,
but
that depends where they are. Yeah, it's like it gets complicated, logistically complicated. Yeah.
yeah, okay. Well, we'll have a look into that. I think the books are the most important thing about it. So that's for people who don't know, there were some. I think there's a lot of people who have already read it, of course. But on our website, everly.net, you can find links to Amazon locations for to get the book, and of course they're available on so many other bookstores. And literally, I'm sure of it.
Pretty much where anybody hearing this lives, you can get it at stores. You can certainly get it from online emporiums. It's not difficult to get hold of, and I encourage you to do so.
Of course, of course.
Also,
And
by the way, it's not. This is not just a sales pitch. In that there are really, by this point, probably thousands of copies that have worked their way into libraries. You're allowed to just read it. I want people to read it. Whether, and I hope you'll buy it, but I certainly hope you'll read it.
I think there's a good chance that most people here will do so if they haven't already done so. So that's going to work out fine. I don't see any questions popping up. So I just want to basically conclude the stream. It's a little bit over an hour, so we've been taking extra time already,
Yeah.
and which is always good. You know, it's interesting to talk with you. You're an easy talker, so 1 hour is nothing for you, I think. This stream will be available on our channel, and we'll be promoting it in the forthcoming days so that people who had to miss it out, because we had to choose a time zone, of course, to start with, which is
Yes.
favorable for some people, but not for all the people, of
And
course.
I'll say this: if people doubted it at all, if in the group people have these broad sorts of questions they want to ask me, they can do it. They can do it online. It's not a problem for me, and I know it's not a problem for the group.
Mhm.
If they're much more specific, Messenger works. If they're extremely, if there's, if they're personal or extremely specific, or other people might not be interested, still get to me by Messenger if you want to. I'm open. I'm open to contact.
Okay, that's always good to hear. I would like to thank you on behalf of our organization, as it's formally called, that you would take the time to talk to us. And I hope that people have learned a thing or two. You know, you've already done quite a few of these things, and but there were quite, I think, good questions coming forward from our group.
Yes.
So
And I
it
want
made
to
it good.
thank you and I want to thank the group for what you've
Okay.
done for me also. And it's
Okay.
been a delight to be here.
Okay. Thank you very much, and we'll be in touch very soon about the books, of
Sure, we
course.
will.
Okay.
Bye
Take
now.
care. Bye
Yep.
bye.